So I want to talk a little bit about how culture plays a role in radical acceptance and even powerlessness, right? Because people really don't like the idea that narcissistic people really don't change much, that it's a personality and it's a personality that's particularly rigid, and that folks with these personalities don't have a well-formed capacity to reflect on their behavior or recognize that their behavior is a problem or harming other people or caring if it harms other people, and instead will shift the blame onto other people. So there's really no drive to change, right? The radical acceptance is around the idea that a narcissistic person's behavior generally won't change. So let's put a finer point on that. It's not just that a narcissistic person won't change, but what is more important to recognize as part of radical acceptance is that you can't do anything to change them. Once you get your head around that, that may be where, as pain and grief-filled as that recognition is, that you finally turn the corner on healing. Now, I've had the opportunity to speak and teach about narcissism, narcissistic abuse, how to support people in therapy in various parts of the world, especially parts of the world where issues around custody can get really tangled up with issues of immigration and citizenship. So family court in those regions can do nothing. And people not only can lose custody of their kids, their children can be taken to other countries, and there's really no recourse. Family court in the United States, needless to say, doesn't work well either, because it does not make allowances for the toxic impact of narcissistic and antagonistic parents on children. And then there's, of course, the divorce industrial complex making billions of dollars on manipulating these situations. In other countries, it is also an absolute mess. And a non-narcissistic protective parent in these regions often has, like I said, zero recourse. And if a marriage ends in some countries in the world, the citizenship rights of the parent who's not originally from that country can end. And I have definitely talked with survivors from around the world who were put in prison by vindictive exes because after the divorce, they were really in a country illegally, and that's how they were kept away from their children. So it can get really, really dark and desolate. Now, this is not meant to be a video on the vagaries of family court and the many, many ways that narcissistic people can abuse international law. No. But as I've traveled around the world quite a bit, especially in the last year, it's been an eye-opener as I've talked to people around the world because they have been through it, and we're still going through it. And in most cases, these were people who were having to make, especially in these child custody cases, having to make the most of periodic visits and video calls and letters with their children. They effectively lost their children, and there really wasn't much they could do to fix that. It was radical acceptance on a different level that I often had to see in the United States in family court, right? Everyone in these situations is suffering. I don't care what damn country you're in. But in these people I was talking to around the world, I saw depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. But a lot of them were still functioning. They had jobs, they had friends, and they were doing their best to maintain lives, despite this heavy reality of their children no longer being with them, hanging over them all the time. The way that the systems were set up, the circumstances, basically rendered these folks completely and utterly powerless. They said that the kind of legal support that they would need to fix this was either not available, was prohibitively expensive, the situation was potentially dangerous, and even with the right legal support and all the money and all that, probably still wouldn't work. And the powerlessness piece, when I had these conversations, hit me hard because I personally feel it every day that I work with survivors. Even we as therapists working with survivors can feel powerless because we can see the distress raised by the trauma bond and the hope and the confusion and the enablers and even other external systems like family court. And it's our job to sit with the pain. I have to say that therapists probably do have revenge fantasies about the narcissistic person in these clients' lives facing some real consequences someday, but it's probably not going to happen. And it's why surviving and healing from narcissistic abuse is so difficult, and why making sense of it is so difficult, because we're powerless. We're powerless to change someone we love. We're powerless to stop the abusive behavior. We're powerless to make a family function more safely or kindly. We're powerless to make courts or human resource departments see this. We're powerless to lead the enablers to see what's going on. We feel powerless. And that, of all the feelings a person can have, is a probably one of the worst, especially in a world where we often feel and believe that we can often get things done. If you're able to get up and go to a job and be effective in it, it can feel crazy that you cannot do anything about these narcissistic relationship situations. So watching people and hearing the stories of people where there was nothing that could be done, no additional court hearing, no mediation session, no evaluation, no new attorney, nothing they could do, was something unique about it. The people I was talking to, some were acutely going through the worst of it. With one person, their situation had only unfolded relatively recently, like in the last couple of years. With others, it was in the past. But they all found that resistance was futile. And what I observed was that it pressed fast forward on their radical acceptance button, and sort of in the most tragic way. So what do we do when there's nothing that we can do to change a situation? Then we're sort of forced to make something of it or go to our true north, because otherwise we collapse. We engage in workarounds, but there's enormous grief. And if there's one universal theme I heard in all these stories, it was that. The grief at losing children, which is unimaginable. The grief at losing a life that they thought they had, a community they were part of. The grief at people sort of shrugging and saying, well, that's how it is here. The enabling in most of these cases was pretty horrific. The grief that absolutely nothing could be done. It was really like sitting with somebody getting a terminal diagnosis. So what's the lesson for those of us who don't live under such powerless circumstances? For how bad it is in the States, it's not quite that. In a way, having options and recourse in these narcissistic situations makes things easier and harder simultaneously. Hope is painful because every day is often a disappointment. And with time, we may slowly lose the hope that the narcissistic person will change. And frankly, some people never quite lose that. But we may have avenues to try to fix it. Unfortunately, as long as we think even one door is a little cracked open, a new lawyer, or the narcissistic person's new relationship ends, or the narcissistic person gets some bad news and turns to you for some help, the rumination will often fester. And we may continue to try and fix the relationship. For example, maybe if I say it this way, maybe if I just go to their dinner, maybe if I give them the money, maybe if I move to that house closer to them, maybe if I take out a bigger loan and get the bigger house, maybe if I got married to that person they want me to get married to, maybe if I quit my job, maybe if I never ask them to do anything, right? You know what the bargaining looks like. We start to make impossible promises to ourselves. Like, maybe if I could just need nothing and take care of everything myself and never complain, then this could work. That little passage is straight from one of my journals years ago. Those stories I heard were stories where these people I was talking to came to the inevitable and permanent conclusion of these relationships a lot more quickly because the structures around them shut down all of their options and effectively gave them no options. It hurt and agonized and pained them. And either people in these situations collapsed, which some people did under these circumstances, and therapists were telling me about that, or they kept on keeping on. But when it was so real and physical that their children were taken away from them or taken to another country, or or the person was forced to move out of that country, and there was still some self-blame, things like, I should have been more savvy about the laws in this place. But when the vindictiveness and entitlement were so culturally and societally protected that there was no sugarcoating the cruelty of these patterns and personalities, what all of these people told me to a T was like, it was unmistakable. You had to see how toxic these personalities were. If you spend enough time around one of these relationships, it's the inevitable conclusion. And this is most pointed for those of you who are co-parenting with narcissistic and antagonistic exes, or who have narcissistic family systems that you still have to interact with. You have to watch this relationship unfold over time. And so you see that the patterns don't change even as the children graduate or move out or get married or have their own families. You get older, the kids get older, the parents or siblings get older, and it doesn't change. And you recognize once and for all, there is nothing you can do, but it can take many of us decades to get there. Because it is not an easy place to get to, when the behavior that other people see from this narcissistic person isn't always bad, or the person is sort of deemed as being successful. For example, I don't know, they have a great job, or they make a lot of money, or they're successful in their career, or they're from a so-called good family. Now, powerlessness, I really do believe in this. Hearing it in so many stories, to me, powerlessness may be the most challenging part of radical acceptance to internalize, because radical acceptance is not just the understanding that it cannot change, but it's also the powerlessness to be able to do anything about a situation that matters to you. I know that survivors often feel powerless in these relationships because they want it to be different. But I really connected it to radical acceptance when I heard these kinds of stories where a culture is like, we're not giving you options. Yeah, it increased the despair, but it also reminded me how core powerlessness was to radical acceptance. And that's likely why so many people are resistant to it. That idea that there's nothing you can do about something, it's just not something that, especially in the United States, that most of us are willing to say, like, no, there's always something that can be done. And in a way, you try it in so many different ways. And I know that for every person, whether it's the 150th time they try or the 1000th time they try, they're like, okay, there's nothing that can be done. And everyone gets to that. And some, if you're lucky, you figure it out after the 10th time. But you actually get to collect the data on it and keep trying. Some people don't get that. And that powerlessness kicks in soon. And then it's either about giving up or getting up and continuing to live armed with the knowledge there actually is nothing else you can do. Like I said, it's the hardest part of radical acceptance, but these stories from around the world reminded me how much powerlessness is the core of that entire system of radical acceptance. Thanks again.